This is the third lecture in Chapter 4, so we'll just go ahead and knock this one out. Last time we finished off talking about the different types of arrangement or disbursements of species, and this time we're going to talk about the difference, or start off talking about the differences between a couple different species. So in this case, we see that there are resources available to a species or species, and we'll make the comparisons of the panda and the raccoon. Sort of similar species, but you can see that one is listed as being a generalist and one is being listed as a specialist. The generalist, the raccoon, means it can pretty much get away with just about anything. It can live in a variety of places, it can eat a variety of foods, it's very tolerant. So as far as resource use goes, it can have a very large niche. It can live just about anywhere. The panda, on the other hand, is very, very, very specialized. It doesn't eat a variety of food. It's not very tolerant. Of course, it is an endangered species. It would be interesting, of course, if it was like the raccoon and you went outside in the morning and saw the panda eating your garbage. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon unless they can genetically change the panda. So just a comparison to take a look at what species are able to tolerate in their given environment. So this one here is just kind of a guess who. The ultimate survivor, the species or some type of that species has been around for about 350 million years. There's lots of different species within the group. Can eat just about anything, live almost anywhere, and can withstand massive amounts of radiation. That species would be the cockroach. Yes, so they will inherit the earth. Under the idea of just how species adapt differently to their environment, you just have a nice little listing here of various birds and some changes or some items that they have that make them better able to utilize resources and avoid competition at the same time. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. You can take a look and see how these differ. Divergence. This again is looking at this idea, not necessarily the same ones, but the idea of Darwin's finches. You can see how they have evolved somewhat differently between the fruit and seed eaters and the insect and nectar eaters, just based on the beaks. Some of them I'm not quite sure. For example, this one here, how that falls into that category, because it looks very much like this one over here. But in any case, it does kind of label it in such group. But there could be some other things, some other variations going on there. This is always, I find this one interesting. You have foxes that have some early common ancestor. And then you have some isolation that occurred either just by the mountains or just because they settled in one location in comparison to another. But you can see how they have evolved differently. For example, the Arctic fox, of course, is white, but all of its appendages are fairly short to maintain body heat. Well, as we said, it has that white fur. And you have the gray fox, which is a little more slender and long to dissipate heat. And of course, it has that grayish color. And these two species can't mate and produce offspring. Offspring, of course, that are fertile. So they, at some point in time, they were the same species, but somewhere along the line, they were isolated and separated. And we just went over that. So, phylogenies. It's those diagrams you've seen before where you see the breaking offs just to compare species. The branch in here usually is representative of some distinct variation that occurs somewhere in their development that has made these species somewhat different from each other. So somewhere in here it says this species behaves like this, whereas this species behaves like that. Some trait separates them So some events must have happened or occurred in this time period that's separated the two, and they no longer can interbreed. Genetic diversity, we kind of mentioned this before, so we'll just kind of hit it again. Genotype versus phenotype. We'll run through that pretty quick. A genotype versus phenotype, again, the genotype is the variation that a certain gene has of expressing itself. So, for example, brown eyes versus blue eyes. And the phenotype, of course, is what you actually see. So you could have two people with brown eyes, but they have a genotype which is mixed, and they could have an offspring with blue eyes, which neither one of the parents have. So that has some variety within a group. So the more genotypes you have available, a species is more able to maintain changes or have changes within its group. Mutations, just to kind of mention that, a mutation is where some of the genetic code that a species has is changed in the DNA. And again, usually it has a negative effect on a species, but occasionally it's something that the species does benefit from. And recombination is kind of a weird one. I don't really understand it. Whereas part of a chromosome breaks off and attaches somewhere else. Sounds easy enough to say, but when you really get down into the work of it, what it actually must entail, that is a little confusing. But the recombination of genetic material is another way that a species can change. Okay, this is looking at some of the evolution by this process and what could benefit the group. If you have mutations, the larger the group, the more likely that is going to add some variety to the group, so it's going to increase the genetic variation within the group, and that's generally perceived as good. Genetic drift, small populations, can have more influence based on the random mating. So if you have some group that has a change within it, then it is more likely to spread its changed information to a smaller group as opposed to a larger group. It would die out in a larger group. Bottleneck effect is where you have some event that takes place. Think of something environmental or some catastrophe that takes place that wipes out a large portion of the population. But a small part does escape or survive. That group's and its genetic information would be passed on to the next generation, good or bad. And the founder's effect is when you have a small group that is isolated from the larger, and it goes on, and its genetic information is, of course, all that's available to start this new group someplace else. And the pace, what is, again, beneficial to evolution? You can look at the rate, slow changing environmental factors. Usually that's a good thing. It gives time for these changes to take hold. If it's a fast change, then usually the species won't last. Just by the number of opportunities, fast changing scenarios within a group usually doesn't work out. Genetic variation, the more in a species, for example, a species has a lot of different phenotypes, the more likely it's going to have a change that's going to be suitable to the environment. Populations, small populations, they're more apt to take a change and it can spread. So if you have a large population, you have a change, it may not hold as well as having a small population. And the last one is generations. Think of bacteria. They turn over very, very rapidly. They're more likely to have a change and it occur quickly. Of course, it could end badly, of course, but it could be more beneficial to the bacteria in a much faster time period because of their quick change over time. All right, we'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll do one last lecture on this chapter next.